Hi, Dr. Lamb. This is Abby again. This week for our Lesson 6 Alternate Assignment. So let's get on with it, shall we? The first part, I wanted to tell you straight off the bat, my survey results were first being competing with 11, compromising with 9, accommodating 8, and then avoiding and collaboration being the same as 7. So I thought I would discuss probably those top 3 and discuss about what the authors say and also how I feel about that. So first with competing, definitely first thing that I read that stuck out to me was that the primary focus is to satisfy one's own concerns and one's own need in the conflict itself, which definitely makes sense. Also, one of the other things that stuck out to me is whenever the author said how the demands of that party who is competing are very apparent, but that competitors tend to hide motives or any other information that can weaken the position. I find myself doing this quite a bit, actually. And I think I do it because, logically, if I think that I am divulging any information that the other party can find fault in, that they have a higher likelihood of winning the argument or somehow having a better likelihood of getting what they want out of it as opposed to what I want. And next, I would say whenever the authors talked about how competitors avoid sacrificing any goals, that made a lot of sense to me too. And not to get too personal or anything, but I think one of the reasons why competing was my highest score was because whenever I was a kid, I have an older brother, so it's just him and I. When we were living with our parents as kids, we were not allowed to or encouraged to express our opinion. It was more so that our parents were dictators and that we were the subjects who didn't have a say. So I think since I didn't have that control as a kid, now that I can have that control as an adult, I think I overcompensate and overdo it a little bit. So definitely need to get better at that. Whenever the authors make the distinction between forcing and contending, contending, in the competing area or the competing style, I would say that I'm more so contending as opposed to forcing because I am not totally inflexible. But as the authors say, those types of competitors tend to be more flexible as long as the party can still attain their goals, which is obviously my main motivation typically in conflict. Moving on to compromising, this one didn't really surprise me that much either, because especially whenever I'm in a conflict with somebody I really care about, I am more likely to be more flexible with them because since I care more about them, I care more about how they feel and their position in the conflict itself. Excuse me. So one of the things that also stuck out to me about compromising was that how the authors were talking about that this type of style has moderate pretty much almost everything. So moderate levels of assertiveness and cooperativeness, moderate to high activeness, moderate flexibility, moderate to moderately high disclosiveness. So with the compromising, they seem to be very, very much involved still in the conflict, as opposed to avoiding, which is, much lower on the activeness and the disclosiveness, really, and the assertiveness, pretty much everything else. And so I think that's why the compromising and accommodating, which I'll get to, I scored higher in as opposed to avoiding because in conflict I still tend to be very interactive. Last thing about the compromising, when the authors make the distinction between firm and flexible compromising, I would probably consider myself more so of a firm compromiser, just because I do recognize trade-offs and offer trade-offs sometimes, but I'm still very limited with it, and I would say that I still have that high activeness in the conflict, but just how I was talking about with competing, I don't necessarily divulge all of the information or everything about the conflict that I'm feeling, because I don't want the other party to find that fault in it. So firm as opposed to flexible when it comes to compromising. And then lastly, going to accommodating. So I was actually surprised that I scored so highly in accommodating, because I know I'm very stubborn and my first reaction is not to accommodate, which, obviously we can see from the survey results themselves. But I think the parts of this that sound most like me are the low to moderate disclosiveness, which is basically whatever I was talking about with the competing and the compromising, how I don't like to divulge too much information or give them too much of a foothold to have the upper hand on me in the conflict interaction. And also I would say that, the part that sounds definitely least like me in the accommodating is that the empowerment of the other party to definitely take control of the situation. I don't like doing that. When the authors then make the distinction in this style of yielding versus conceding, I would consider myself more so a conceder as opposed to a yielder, because if I'm accommodating, I will accommodate the other's concerns, but I'm definitely still more involved. I don't just, let them have their way and, throw whatever. Yeah, okay, everything's out the window now. And I would say that I would be more involved, which is why I would be more so of a conceder as opposed to a yielder. One of the things I wanted to say overall for these three, whenever the book talked about the complementary styles of conflict management, I thought it was extremely interesting that competing and accommodating are considered complementary between two different parties. I found it interesting that they were both found in my 3 highest scores. I think they're very different, but it makes sense as to me and how I move about my conflict interactions, switching between them depending on the situation and depending on who I'm having the conflict with. So I think now I'll move on to part 2 about the article. I was thinking about the metaphor that was presented with the foot on the gas or the brake or both, and I would say that I respond either with the foot on the gas or the foot on the brake, depending on the situation or the period of time in the conflict itself. And I say that because I tend to be more aggressive towards the beginning of the conflict and towards the beginning of the interaction itself, whereas I start to put my foot on the brake and become more so of a compromiser or an accommodator towards the end of the conflict. So depending on where I'm at is what I would do. And then as far as emotional awareness goes, I am a very deeply emotional person. I have recognized that. It is a flaw, but also a strength in some situations. So I would say that I'm pretty highly emotionally aware of myself. I'm also pretty capable of picking up on the emotions of others and sensing when something is wrong with someone or if someone is lying to me, which comes in handy. So then using that as a transition to my emotional awareness plan, I would say that I am pretty sufficiently emotionally aware of myself, and therefore I would like to spend more time and effort becoming more emotionally aware of others during conflict and more aware of their emotions. And so sort of the three things that I was focusing on for this plan would be, first, I would like to practice more so listening to understand rather than listening to respond. I know typically sometimes I start to forget what I wanted to say, and so I start thinking to myself, okay, what am I going to say next whenever they stop talking so that way I can get my point across. Well, I've found that this isn't necessarily extremely productive. And so I think by listening to understand, the article does talk about this too, about listening to the feelings that are being presented. I think by doing that more, I'll be able to focus more so on the conflict and the situation itself rather than how I'm feeling about it, and therefore I can put more so my emotions aside so I can listen to what the other person is really telling me. Second would be to take responsibility more often when applicable to behaviors resulting, or for my behaviors resulting in specific emotions of other people. So that might not make much sense, but I thought about a specific situation when crafting that. That situation is how whenever I was working at my previous employer and the job was honestly making me pretty miserable, so I would come home to my husband and, of course, complain. And he then shared with me that even though he knows logically that I am not upset with him, it starts to feel as though I am upset with him because by me venting, he is the receiver of that hostility and the anger and just all the resentment and angst that was built up. And so he still had those feelings as though it was being directed at him whenever he obviously wasn't the issue. So at first I didn't quite understand that. I didn't know why he was feeling that way because it obviously wasn't about him. So to take more responsibility for that, I think would really help in conflict interactions, especially with my husband, to think more so about how my behaviors are making him feel. And then the third thing would be, to not take things so personally. Whenever I'm listening to someone, if they have an issue and I'm involved, I take it personally, whereas I can just let it go and say and reassure myself that they're obviously upset about the situation and that it isn't necessarily an attack on me. I hope this plan helps my communication with my husband and my in-laws most, because the fact of the matter is that both my husband and I have grown up in very different environments, where we both of our families and us individually, we have dealt with conflict very differently. So I think because of that, we've had a couple misunderstandings that could have easily been solved with better communication or by communicating it in the same way. So with this emotional awareness plan, I think that will definitely help because I'll be taking into account more so thinking about how they deal with conflict and being aware of how they deal with it emotionally as well. And what this would look like to me is for us to have more calm and productive interactions as opposed to having more so understandings or me not being open-minded or something happening that is definitely not productive and that the situation itself doesn't get resolved. Okay, I think that's everything. Sorry, I know I took a little bit more time, but there was a lot to get across. So thank you. See you next week.